Animology is brought to you by you, the listeners of this podcast. If you'd like Animology to show up in your earbuds each week, please go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau to help us reach our goal. For just $10 a month, that's about 30 cents a day, you can make this podcast possible and get written transcripts to each and every episode of Animology. For just $1 a day, you get that and more, including bonus material, bonus episodes, and behind-the-scenes sneak peeks. So go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau to become a listener supporter. Whatever level you choose, thank you for helping change the way we talk and think about animals. Welcome to Animology, a podcast about language, the animal-related words and expressions we use every day, and how they shape and reflect our relationship with animals. I'm Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Today's episode is Falconry, fed up with hunting. In this episode, we'll examine all of the words, idioms, and phrases that come from the practice of hunting wild birds with trained birds for fun, i.e. falconry. There are many, many false etymologies associated with this blood sport, so we will straighten them out in today's episode. And I'll tell you about the time I actually tried my hand at falconry. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, a lover of words, lover of animals. As always, you can find out more about my work at animologypodcast.com, where you can leave your comments and questions. You can also subscribe to this podcast, and I encourage you to do so at iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And please leave a review. I'd be most grateful if you would also share this podcast with your peeps on social media. All of this helps others to find Animology. Thank you so much. My husband, David, and I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, and we used to take many trips up to New England. For a time before we moved to California, I was an editor at a travel publication, one of the perks of which was visiting many of the beautiful properties whose reviews I was editing in both the U.S. and abroad. One such hotel was the Equinox in Vermont, a very old-school, quintessentially New England hotel in the beautiful town of Manchester. Built originally as a tavern in 1769 and added to the National Register of Places in 1972, it evolved over the centuries into the 2,300-acre resort it is today. One of the recreational attractions of the hotel is the affiliated School of Falconry, which no doubt adds to the patrician feel of the hotel and the area. At the time of our visit, this is now many years ago, almost 2 decades ago, I was already vegetarian for ethical reasons, having discovered my discomfort at supporting violence against animals in the meat industry. And I was already an animal advocate. But I was also, I always have been, always will be, someone who loves being around animals. So without really knowing anything about falconry, not having grown up as an aristocrat in England in the 17th century, but thinking how incredible it would be to interact with these remarkable raptors, we signed up for the day-long class during which we were to learn hawk identification, raptor training, the falconer's equipment, and the history of falconry. Over the course of the day, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the methods and purpose of falconry, which you'll hear about in this episode. And I also became aware of how many of our everyday words and expressions come from this centuries-old hunting method that was a huge status symbol among the nobles of medieval Europe. Falconry reached its height of popularity in the 17th century in the United Kingdom and in Europe, but it really came into its own in England and in English during a time when new words and phrases were pouring into the English language from the French-speaking aristocracy after the Norman Conquest. Of course, the Norman Conquest was the result of the victory of William the Conqueror over King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, ending the line of Anglo-Saxon kings and beginning the succession of Norman kings. Also called William the Bastard, he could easily just have been called William the Hunter, because he was just that, a zealous hunter who imposed what became known as forestry laws. forbidding anyone to hunt on any land designated by the king as hunting preserves solely for himself and his family. Over the years, peasants and nobles alike grew to hate these restrictions, for which there were serious consequences for disobeying, including dismemberment and death. Whereas today's episode will focus on English words that come from the practice of hunting birds using raptors, i.e. falconry, in another episode we'll discuss words that come from hunting animals in general, but I wanted to give you an idea as to how significant hunting was to William and his Norman family and followers, a blood sport that killed not only countless animals, but also many members of William's own household. William's second son, Richard, was killed in his teens while hunting. His eldest son, William Rufus, who became King William II, died when he was shot by an arrow while out hunting, and many years later a nephew, also named Richard, was killed while hunting in the same new forest William the Conqueror had established as royal hunting grounds. Before the invention of guns, hunting involved killing animals with, among other human-conceived weapons, arrows. And for hunting enthusiasts who wanted to kill small birds in the wild, it was nearly impossible to succeed with just arrows. Unless you're naturally equipped with the speed and eyesight and weaponry and skills of a raptor, it turns out it's really difficult to kill birds in flight. But determined to succeed, humans found a way. Not through any natural skills of their own, but by exploiting those of another animal, namely birds of prey. Someone, somewhere, about 2,000 years ago, figured out that if they trained raptors, or birds of prey, such as hawks, eagles, and falcons, who are, of course, the natural predators of small mammals and smaller birds, hunting enthusiasts could have their kill and deny it to the ones who did all the work. One of the things that became very apparent to me very quickly at the falconry school is that there's absolutely nothing natural about falconry, which may not surprise you, but you have to manipulate the birds in every way possible to do your bidding, to kill for you, and to bring you the kill rather than allow them to eat their catch themselves. So before we dig deep into the origins of words and phrases that come directly from falconry, I want to say that there are numerous words and expressions falsely attributed to this blood sport. If I included all of them, we would be here all day. And distinguishing fact from fiction wasn't easy. It took days and days. Not going to get into every false etymology here, but I will mention a couple to start off with that are related in that they have to do with animals in general, which is, of course, the purpose of this podcast. For the most part, however, this episode will focus on words and phrases we can document as having come directly from the blood sport of falconry. Most birds used for falconry in Britain were taken from the wild, either in Britain or from abroad, and then imported. Later on, there was captive breeding, and I'll talk a little later on about laws today in the UK and the US around live trapping and captive breeding. By whatever means you obtained him, once you had your bird, of course, you have to keep him captive if you want to use him for hunting. And I want to be clear that hunting with birds of prey had nothing to do with sustenance for people to eat at all. This absolutely had to do with a status symbol, absolutely about a status symbol. This was not about being hungry and needing to eat. So I just really want to make that clear when we talk about this blood sport, which is why I keep calling it that, because it really was just that. It was an activity that was dominated by the nobles because it was very expensive, and it was purely for fun and pleasure. In order to keep the bird, you need to keep him tethered on a leash. Now, neither the word tether nor the word leash originated with falconry, though you will see many books and websites perpetuating this myth. But the terms were, of course, used in falconry. A tether is a rope by which an animal is tied to a stake or the like in order to confine him to one spot. Both the noun and the verb tether are first documented in English in the late 1300s in the sense of being some kind of cord to fasten an animal, most likely originally referring to farmed animals who are restrained such. And of course, it would have been used to refer to the act of or the means of securing a falcon to a perch. In most cases, as you can imagine, the animal being tethered tries to free himself but cannot. They may struggle against the tether, fail, and become frustrated, which is most likely the origin of the phrase to be at the end of my tether and the related to be at the end of my rope, meaning that your frustration is so peaked that you just can't take it anymore. Straining at the leash is another, as is champing, sometimes chomping at the bit, which we'll return to when we talk about words related to horses. Although there isn't enough evidence to say that these expressions come to us directly from falconry, the straining at the leash or at the end of my tether, at the end of my rope, they are fitting phrases for behavior that would have no doubt been perceived in frustrated, tethered birds. Another aspect of the training involves hooding the bird, putting a hood on the bird to essentially blind him, which was one of the things I was really uncomfortable with when we were at the falconry school. Vision is the most important sense for a bird, especially for raptors who can see up to 8 times more clearly than the human eye. It's said that golden eagles can see a rabbit from a mile away. But in the training of a bird for falconry, the bird's eyes are covered to stop him from being distracted. Having such good vision and being able to spot an animal from so far away, it's natural for raptors to become so focused on their prey that the trainer can't get their attention. So hooding them prevents them from seeing what's around them. Because the hood is a way of deceiving the bird in such a situation, it can be said that the bird is being hoodwinked, which of course means to trick or deceive someone. After doing much research, I, for one, am not convinced that this word came from falconry, though you'll often find it on lists of falconry-related words. And it's the only bit of false etymology I'm going to share with you. Now, the hood part is true. Falcons were and are hooded during this training process, but the word hoodwinked appears to have come into English in the 16th century as a compound word combining hood plus wink, both of which are Old English words. Although it is what the birds experience, I have found no evidence that the word comes directly from falconry. Our next word, however, most certainly does. And just a quick note, most supporters of this podcast receive the transcripts of Animology, which I know is really helpful to read in addition to listen to. So supporters at $10 and above receive the transcript to every one of these episodes. So thank you to everyone for being a supporter at every level, and thank you to our top supporters, David Cabrera and Alexander Gray, Gwen Mayo, Jennifer and Ben Ellis, Tim Anderson, Ulrich, Renee Marinkovich, Sylvie Raquel, and Peter Liu, who make this podcast possible. And thank you to all at every single level. You can become a supporter at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau or animologypodcast.com and click on the donate button. Thank you. The next aspect of the training is to acclimate the bird to catching the prey and returning the prey to the trainer. To accomplish this, the falconer secures feathers to a piece of meat in order to entice the bird. The falconer would allow the hawk or falcon at this point to have his hood removed so that he could pursue this meat, which has the feathers attached. Once the hawk becomes attracted to this feathered meat, the falconer then secures the meat to some string and whirls it round and round in the air. The idea is to teach the hawk to go after another bird who's in flight. As a result, the bird in training starts to correlate feathers with food, the reward in the form of meat that he would receive from the trainer. Next, the bird would then be permitted to fly on his own without being tethered and learn to return to the trainer with the meat. From this process, an English word was coined. Actually, 3 English words. The word lure. A lure is the name for the feathered meat, the bit of meat that has the feathers secured to it. This is the origin of the word, and it came into English in the 14th century to mean something which entices. It came from Old French loire, which was the name of the device used to recall hawks. So the word lure comes directly from falconry, as did the verb allure and the related adjective alluring. Today, alluring means anything that's enticing or beguiling, and allure, the verb, means to attract with something desirable. But it first meant to attract, to captivate, to train a falcon to hunt. So lure, allure, and alluring have their roots in this blood sport. The next element of training involves introducing the raptors to live birds. So the falcon or hawk would pursue a bird and snatch him in midair with his powerful claws. You've heard of a talon, no doubt, Talon, which is technically the name for the heel claw of a raptor. But the anterior claws aren't called talons, they're called pounces, Pounces, which came into English in the 15th century from the word punchin, borrowed from French, which meant a pointed tool or a tool for punching, and which also gave us our English word punch to refer to something sharp, punching holes in things, like a hole punch. The meaning of the word pounce to refer to raptors' claws changed over time to refer to the process of seizing something or someone with one's claws, like a cat leaping on a mouse. So the words pounce and punch are cognate and are directly related to raptors. You can see by now how contrived the entire process is and how much manipulation takes place, and it was one of the reasons I continued to grow uneasy when I attended that falconry school, especially when I saw how controlled their food was, which gives us more words and expressions. I mentioned that the raptors are trained to bring whatever they catch back to the trainer. These predators are not allowed to eat the prey they catch. In order to motivate them to hunt, you have to feed them at very specific times and weigh them several times a day to make sure they're hungry enough to hunt. If the birds have already eaten and have a full stomach, they aren't motivated to hunt. And of course, their hunt isn't really theirs in the end anyway. And they simply aren't motivated to fly. We terrestrially bound humans tend to perceive flying as this beautiful and glorious thing in birds, and it is, but it's work for birds. It expends energy. And as a raptor, if you're already satiated, if you're already sated, why would you fly? Why would you hunt? At this point, a falcon or bird who's sated and whose belly is full is called fed up. He's fully sated, he's fully fed, but of course, this isn't what the falconer, the hunter, wants. He wants the bird to hunt. So he regulates his food so the bird is never fully sated, never fed up. Another scenario the falconer tries to prevent through food manipulation is when the bird catches the prey he's worked really hard to get and eats the prey animal himself. If a raptor being trained to hunt for someone else realizes that he can provide food on his own without relying on that human, he's out of there. He's fed up and is gone. So the falconer has to control every step to prevent this, including giving the falcon only a small amount of food once he brings back the prey. If the falcon gets too much food, again, he'll be fed up and won't continue to hunt. And the idea is to keep the bird hungry enough to be motivated to hunt. This strategy also reinforces the idea that the falconer is the bird's primary source of food. Only when the bird is returned to his home base will he be permitted a proper meal. And so at the falconry school that day, we learned that before a falconer hunts with a bird again, he weighs the bird very carefully. If the bird exceeds his flying weight, the weight at which he's hungry enough to hunt and strong enough to do it efficiently, the falconer will not hunt with him if he exceeds that flying weight. As I said, raptors hunt only when they're hungry. Most animals hunt only when they're hungry because the effort and risk of making a kill are great. A fed-up raptor, one that's not motivated by food, will not be interested in hunting or in returning to the falconer for food. So they're denied food until they're hungry enough to kill, all of it based on the precise weight of the bird at any given time during the day. And of course, over time, fed up has passed into general parlance, meaning unwilling or unable to put up with something anymore. But fed up is indeed a falconry term. A bird who was not fed up and did take flight, however, was said to turn tail, which came into English in the 1580s as a falconry term. It originally meant to turn the back, hence to run away or take flight. But now the phrase tends to connote running away in fear, suggesting cowardliness or unwillingness to face a challenge or responsibility. And it's a common expression today, to turn tail, but originally it was a falconry term referring to a hawk or falcon just taking flight. Now, hearty drinking by a hawk was known as bowsing or bowsing, also pronounced boozing. You see where I'm going with this? The Middle English word bowsen or boozin, B-O-U-S-E-N, meaning to drink to excess, appears to have come from a Dutch word meaning the same, and it's said to be linked to our modern slang term for alcohol, booze, and to the verb booze, to drink too much alcohol. Booze as a noun and booze as a verb. Though it is difficult to pinpoint the exact origin, there does seem to be a legitimate connection with this falconry term bowsing or bowsing or boozing, the excess drinking of a hawk, and our modern word boozing, which has left behind its falconry reference and means to drink too much, to drink to excess. Now, usually only young birds are trained for falconry, but sometimes older hawks are wild caught. In the United Kingdom, after bird protection groups tried to outlaw falconry altogether but failed, they succeeded at least in making it illegal for falconers to use wild-caught birds. They can only use captive-bred birds, and it's regulated via inspectors and DNA sampling. Not so in the United States. Remarkably, even considering how hard a time birds of prey have had here in the U.S. after decades of persecution, falconers are allowed to trap certain raptors with special trapping permits issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service and by state wildlife agencies. They're used either for falconry, for this blood sport, or they're often rented out by such places as resorts to be used to scare away birds considered undesirable or pests, such as gulls, crows, and pigeons. So the word to refer to a wild-caught bird, particularly to a female bird in her adult plumage, is a haggard, Haggard. It came into English in the 1560s and denoted an intractable or untamed bird. If you can imagine how a wild bird would look after she's been subdued and is desperate to escape, you can see how the word haggard came to mean someone who looks exhausted, distraught, and often gaunt in appearance. The word haggard came from the old French word Haggard, meaning wild, but where that word comes from is yet unknown. The English word hag, which we still use pejoratively to mean an old, ugly, or repulsive woman, is attested as far back as 1230, not to mean an old, ugly, or repulsive woman, but to mean an evil spirit or demon female form applied in early use to the Furies and Harpies of Greco-Latin mythology. No doubt over time, the word hag, right, originally to mean an evil spirit or a demon female form, was influenced by the meaning of the word haggard, which was the distraught, exhausted bird, which came to mean just being exhausted or distraught. So no doubt over time, the word hag was influenced by the meaning of the word haggard as it shifted from a wild-caught female falcon to unkempt and careworn. So that's how we get the word hag today when we talk about an old woman, obviously in a very pejorative and offensive way. And we have the word haggard, which means unkempt or careworn. Of course, the word haggard is still in our English vernacular. If you ever heard of British author Henry Rider Haggard, known more commonly as H. Rider Haggard, so we have a proper surname in the word Haggard. He was a British novelist who lived from 1856 to 1925 in the thick of British colonialism and is the author of the popular novels King Solomon's Mines and She, which, having sold over 83 million copies by 1965, is considered one of the best-selling books of all time. I bet you didn't know that. I didn't know that until I did some research, and I've read the novel She. It's a fascinating, interesting novel. He certainly perpetuates stereotypes of Africans in his novels, but he also portrays them sympathetically, and She is a novel unlike any I've ever read, especially for its time, so I would check it out. But here we have Haggard added to our list of falconry-related words, both the noun and the proper noun, the surname. Another French word that came into English from falconry is one we use commonly today. After sleeping, falcons were seen to wake up and shake their feathers. The verb for this action of waking up and shaking off sleep was rouser, which came into English as rouse in the 1580s, R-O-U-S-E. Today, to rouse someone is to awaken or wake someone up, and in a more general term now, to become active or excited, to rouse. And from rouse, we also get the word arouse, having the same meaning, first attested in Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 2 in 1616. Arouse and arousal came to denote sexual excitement in the late 1940s. So rouse, arouse, and arousal, all from falconry. Another expression that seems to be related to this blood sport is the proverb, a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. In other words, it's better to have a small but certain advantage than a mere potential of a greater one. It appears to date back to medieval falconry, where a bird in the hand, the falcon, was a valuable asset and certainly worth more than two other birds, the prey, in the bush. As I said, falconry was a huge status symbol, which is why you'll see a number of portraits of nobles with a falcon or a hawk tethered to their hand. It was a real sign of affluence. The first citation of the expression, a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, the first citation we have in print in its currently used form is found in John Ray's A Handbook of Proverbs from 1670. But there is a version of it from 1530, 100 years before or more, in the Book of Nurture or School of Good Manners, reminding readers that a bird in hand is worth 10 that fly at large. Variations of the proverb appear even earlier than that. The earliest English version is from Wycliffe's version of the Bible in 1382, and we have variants in 13th century Latin texts, such as in Ecclesiastes 9, a living dog is better than a dead lion. The expression fits well into the list of English language proverbs warning against unnecessary risk-taking, and non-animal related proverbs with a similar meaning would be fools rush in, or angels fear to tread, look before you leap, marry in haste, repent at leisure, and the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. So take your pick from these non-animal related idioms that say the same thing, that warn against unnecessary risk-taking. And so there we have it. Lure, allure, alluring, pounce, turn tail, haggard, hag, rouse, arousal, and arouse, all definitely originating with falconry. We have a bird in hand is worth two in the bush, and booze most likely being related to falconry, fed up and hoodwinked being related to falconry, but not necessarily originating with it, and at the end of my tether, at the end of my rope, straining at the leash, and champing at the bit, all referring to animals being restrained. And these animals included birds of prey, all of whom were trapped in frustrating situations, all part of our everyday language and vernacular. In the end, I'm glad I had the experience seeing firsthand what falconry was all about, to be able to draw my own conclusions. Admittedly, it was kind of amazing to hold these incredible animals on my arm, whose bodies are so light but so powerful. But I wouldn't do it again. Like fox hunting, it's just hunting for the pleasure of it, which in itself is not something I support. But because it's gilded with so much ancient pomp and circumstance, it has this air of romance to it. When you see it through the lens of the animal, however, there's nothing romantic about it. Seeing these majestic birds with a hood covering the top part of their heads so they can't even see around them, with a leash leash attached to their leg, sitting on a cold scale to weigh them in order to precisely control their natural instincts and keep them hungry, none of it sat well with me. When I look at animals, not through my own human eyes, but through the lens of what they would want for themselves, you get an entirely different perspective, and that's the perspective I came away with. We can't deny that our language hasn't been enriched by a blood sport that uses animals to hurt other animals for our own pleasure. And though most of us aren't even aware that these expressions came from falconry, and certainly none of us are tacitly supporting the tethering of hawks or the trapping of falcons when we say, "at the end of my rope," or "he's looking pretty haggard," hopefully we know a little more than we did before we came to this episode, and we'll remember the raptors hiding in our language, in our expressions. And take heart, we have many, many examples of words and phrases that don't come from our exploitation of animals, but which come from the awe and reverence we hold for them for their own sake. And you'll hear all of those coming up in future episodes of Animology. Until then, for the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you for listening to and supporting Animology, changing the way we talk and think about animals.